At 40 below, the only warm place left in the valley was the cabin everyone had spent months laughing at. The front door burst open as icy wind howled inside. Snow swirled across the floorboards, but the thermometer hanging from the center beam still read 66 degrees. Grant stood frozen beside the stove, staring at the man who had mocked him all year. Behind him, Duke suddenly struggled to stand, then collapsed hard against the wooden floor. Outside, the blizzard kept screaming through the mountains, and nobody in the room knew what would happen next. What do you think was really keeping that cabin alive? The wind hit the cabin long before midnight. It came down from the Bitterroot Mountains in long, mournful waves, slipping through the pines and rolling across the frozen valley like something alive. Snow hissed against the walls. The old cabin groaned softly in response, every board and nail complaining under the weight of another Montana winter. Grant Walker opened his eyes before he fully woke up. For one confused second, he wasn't in Montana. He was back in the desert. A distant whistle cut through the darkness. His body reacted before his mind caught up. Grant rolled from the bed, hit the floor hard, and reached for boots that weren't there yet. His heart pounded. The whistle came again. Then he realized what it was. Wind. Just wind forcing itself through a crack somewhere in the north wall. Grant remained crouched beside the bed, breathing slowly. The darkness settled around him. No incoming mortar, no radio chatter, no men shouting coordinates, only the cabin, only winter, only silence. Almost. A low sound came from the corner. Grant turned. A pair of amber eyes watched him through the dark. Easy, Duke. The German shepherd lifted his head from the rug beside the door. His ears twitched. Then he lowered his head again. Grant rubbed a hand across his face and checked the clock beside the bed. 2:17 the same time he usually woke up. Some habits survived wars, some never left. He pulled himself back onto the mattress without taking off his jacket. His boots stayed beside the bed where they always were. Old ranger habits. Sleep light, move fast, be ready. Outside, the wind continued its assault. Inside, the cold slowly pushed through the walls. Grant could feel it creeping across the floorboards. The cabin had been built sometime in the late 1940s. Nobody knew exactly when. The logs had shrunk, the seams had widened. Every winter found a new weakness, and every year it became harder to fight. Duke rose quietly and moved across the room. Not because someone told him to, because he always did. The dog settled between Grant and the front door. Guard position. The same place every night. Grant smiled faintly. Still on duty, huh? Duke's tail thumped once. Then the cabin fell silent again. For a while, Grant drifted into a shallow sleep. A sleep that never lasted long. Hours later, another sound pulled him awake. Not wind, not the cabin. A soft trembling. Grant frowned. The room was darker now. Colder too. He sat up slowly. The trembling continued. His eyes adjusted. Duke, the German shepherd, was curled tightly near the stove. Too tightly. His entire body shook. Grant swung his legs over the bed. Duke. The dog lifted his head. His eyes looked tired. Grant crossed the room and knelt beside him. The moment he touched Duke's ear, his stomach tightened. Ice cold. Far colder than it should have been. Duke tried to stand. His back legs trembled. Grant immediately grabbed another blanket and wrapped it around him. Come on, buddy. Duke leaned against him. Grant could feel every rib beneath the thick fur. The dog wasn't starving, but winter always stole weight from him. The older he got, the harder it became. Grant looked toward the wood stove. The fire was still burning, not strongly, but enough. At least it should have been enough. He stood and walked toward the thermometer hanging near the kitchen shelf. The little metal needle sat perfectly still. 37 degrees. Grant stared at it, then looked around the room. 37 degrees. Inside the cabin. Not outside. Inside. He checked again. Same reading. The realization settled heavily into the room. The stove wasn't failing. The wood wasn't failing. The cabin was. The walls couldn't hold heat anymore. The wind took everything. Grant stood there for a long moment. Outside, snow blasted against the windows. Inside, Duke shivered beneath 3 blankets. The image struck harder than he expected. He remembered another winter. January. The year before. A blizzard that lasted nearly 6 days. The cabin never climbed above 40 degrees. Water froze in the sink. Ice formed inside the corners of the windows. One morning, he had found Duke sleeping directly beside the stove with frost gathered on the tips of his whiskers. That memory had bothered him ever since. Now, it returned with painful clarity. Grant slowly walked back and sat beside the dog. Duke rested his head on his knee. Neither moved. The wind screamed outside. Grant stared into the orange glow of the stove. Most people in Elk Creek thought he preferred being alone. That wasn't exactly true. He simply got tired of explaining things, tired of pretending he slept well, tired of answering questions about the war, tired of hearing people thank him for things they didn't understand. Out here, it was simpler. The mountains didn't ask questions. Duke didn't ask questions. They just stayed. Grant scratched behind the dog's ears. "You've got one more winter in you." The words sounded confident. He didn't feel confident. Duke closed his eyes, trusting him completely. That trust hurt more than any insult ever could, because it came with responsibility. Grant looked toward the north wall, toward the places where moonlight slipped through cracks, no bigger than a pencil, tiny openings, tiny failures, enough to lose a war against winter. He sat there until dawn began turning the windows pale gray. The storm eased slightly. The valley emerged beneath fresh snow. Pines bent beneath white weight. The mountains stood frozen against the horizon. Beautiful, merciless. Grant carried a cup of coffee onto the porch. Duke followed slowly, still stiff, still cold. The old dog sat beside him and stared across the valley. Grant wrapped his coat tighter. The morning air burned his lungs. And suddenly, from somewhere deep inside his memory, something surfaced. Not Montana, not snow, not winter. Heat, unbearable heat, mud, water, tall reeds, moving in the wind. Louisiana. The memory arrived so suddenly that he almost laughed. A swamp, thousands of miles away. A place where the air felt thick enough to drink. A place he hadn't thought about in years. Grant stared toward the mountains. The image refused to leave. Tall reeds, layered walls, still air. And for the first time since the cold season began, a small idea stirred in the back of his mind. An impossible idea. A ridiculous idea. Maybe the kind people would laugh at. But as Duke leaned quietly against his leg, Grant found himself looking south, toward a place buried in memory. Toward a solution hidden in the hottest place he had ever known. And for the first time in months, he wondered if winter could be beaten after all. The idea followed Grant Walker, everywhere, over the next few days. It followed him while he split firewood behind the cabin. It followed him while he repaired a loose section of fencing near the creek. It followed him while he sat beside the stove at night with Duke sleeping at his feet. Louisiana. The word felt strange in Montana. Like remembering another planet. One afternoon, snow drifted softly beyond the cabin windows while Grant sat at the kitchen table with an old notebook. The notebook had traveled through 2 deployments, 3 states, and nearly 15 years of civilian life. Most pages were blank. Some contained rough sketches, coordinates, supply lists, observations from places he preferred not to think about anymore. He turned to an empty page. Then he picked up a pencil. For a long moment, he simply stared. Duke lifted his head from the rug and watched him. Grant began drawing. One square, then another around it. Lines, arrows, airflow. He stopped, erased, started again. The details refused to come clearly. Only fragments remained. Heat, stillness, layers. The memory sat just beyond reach. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin. The sound made him glance toward the window. For a second his chest tightened. His eyes instinctively searched for movement, a habit left over from years of watching ridgelines through rifle optics. Nothing. Just snow, just Montana. Grant exhaled and returned to the notebook. Louisiana. Not the war. The storm. That was where the memory lived. More than 20 years earlier, before Desert Storm, before retirement, before the gray in his beard. A hurricane had torn through southern Louisiana. His ranger unit had been attached to a relief operation. The mission itself had been simple. Move supplies, help civilians, keep roads open. Grant remembered endless water. Water where roads should have been. Water where fields should have been. Water reflecting a sky so bright it hurt to look at. The heat had been brutal, even at dawn, especially for men who had grown up in places like Montana. One afternoon, their convoy stopped near a small Cajun community. Grant remembered stepping from a truck expecting relief from the heat. Instead, he walked straight into it. The air felt thick enough to chew, yet something strange caught his attention. Several small homes sat among the marsh grass. Simple structures. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. But inside them, the temperature felt different. Not cold, not air-conditioned. Just calm. As if the heat outside had somehow been slowed down. He remembered standing inside one of those homes while sweat dried on his skin. An old man had noticed him looking at the walls. The walls were packed with dried marsh reeds, layer upon layer. Natural material, nothing complicated. The old man spoke with a thick accent Grant could barely understand, but one sentence had stayed with him all these years. The air don't move much in here. CT, CT. At the time, Grant hadn't thought much about it. Now, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The air don't move much in here. Still, air. That was the difference. Not heat. Not insulation. Stillness. The pencil moved faster across the notebook. Duke rose and walked over. The German shepherd rested his head on Grant's knee. Grant scratched behind his ears absent-mindedly. Maybe we're onto something, buddy. Duke's tail thumped once against the floor. The next few days became a routine. Morning chores. Notebook. Coffee. More sketches. More memories. The idea slowly began taking shape. Not rebuilding the cabin. Wrapping it. Creating another shell around the existing walls. A space where air could sit still. A buffer between winter and the warmth inside. The concept sounded ridiculous every time he said it out loud. Yet the more he studied it, the more it made sense. One evening he spread several drawings across the table. Duke watched from beneath the chair. Grant compared measurements from the cabin. Wall thickness, wind direction, sun exposure. The north side was always the worst. Every winter storm hit it first. Every cold draft seemed to begin there. He made notes until long after dark. By midnight, the stove had burned low. The room glowed orange and gold. Grant leaned back in his chair, exhaustion finally catching up. The pencil slipped from his fingers. His eyes closed. And suddenly he wasn't in the cabin anymore. Rotor blades thundered overhead. A radio crackled. Someone shouted coordinates. LZ marked. Move, move, move. Grant jerked awake. His heart slammed against his ribs. The chair nearly tipped backward. For several seconds he couldn't breathe. The kitchen. Montana. Not the desert. Not the war. Duke was already beside him. The dog pressed his head against Grant's arm, grounding him, bringing him back. Grant rubbed a hand over his face. You're getting too old to babysit me. Duke stared at him, unimpressed. Grant laughed softly. A real laugh. The first in a while. Outside, dawn was beginning to lighten the horizon. The mountains emerged from darkness. Snow-covered. Silent. Watching. Grant carried his coffee onto the porch. Duke followed. They stood together in the freezing air. For a long time neither moved. Then Duke suddenly stiffened. His ears shot forward. Something had caught his attention. Grant noticed immediately. Years of military training had taught him to trust changes in behavior, especially from dogs. What's up? Duke stepped off the porch. Not running. Purposeful. Focused. He looked back once, then continued toward the southern edge of the property. Grant frowned. The dog rarely behaved that way. He set down his coffee, pulled on his gloves, and followed. Duke moved through the snow at a steady pace, down a narrow trail, past a stand of lodgepole pines, toward a low area near the valley floor, the old marshland. Grant hadn't visited it in months. Duke kept going, nose close to the ground, following something, or searching for something. The farther south they traveled, the softer the snow became. The terrain changed. The scent of water lingered beneath the cold air. Then Duke suddenly stopped. His tail rose. His body became rigid. Grant stepped beside him and froze. Spread across the marshland, before them stood thousands upon thousands of tall brown stalks rising above the snow. Cattail reeds. The exact same kind he had seen in Louisiana all those years ago. Duke looked back at him. Grant stared at the field, then at the notebook tucked beneath his arm, then back at the reeds. For the first time, the impossible idea no longer felt impossible. It felt real. And somewhere deep inside, hope began to replace the cold. For the first time all winter, Grant Walker could see a path forward. He just didn't know yet how much that path was about to change both of their lives. The marsh became part of their routine. Every morning before sunrise, Grant loaded tools into the back of his aging pickup: a thermos of coffee, a handsaw, rope, heavy gloves, sometimes a notebook. Duke was always ready before him. The German shepherd would be waiting by the truck, tail moving slowly, ears forward, as if he understood the mission schedule. Grant appreciated that. Military life had taught him that the best partners were the ones who didn't need every order repeated twice. The first time he cut the cattails, he realized how much work lay ahead. There were thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. Golden brown stalks stretched across the frozen marsh like a sea trapped beneath winter. Grant knelt and studied them. Strong, flexible, lightweight. The old Cajun homes flashed through his memory again. The walls, the trapped air, the quiet. He grabbed the first stalk and cut, then another, and another. The work continued for hours. By noon, his shoulders burned. By evening, his gloves were soaked. Duke worked beside him the entire time. Not because the dog could carry much, because he seemed determined to participate. Every so often, Duke would drag loose bundles toward the truck. Sometimes, he simply stayed close, watching the tree line, watching everything. Grant noticed that too. Years in uniform had taught him something important. A good dog often saw danger before people did. By the end of the first week, stacks of drying reeds surrounded the cabin. The place looked strange already. Like a farmer had decided to build a fort out of marsh grass. Grant didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like he was working towards something instead of simply surviving. The project gave shape to his days. The nightmares came less often, not gone, just quieter. One night he even managed nearly 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep. That hadn't happened in a very long time. A few days later, he drove into Elk Creek for supplies. The town sat beneath a blanket of snow and wood smoke. Nothing much changed in Elk Creek. People still gathered at Miller's Diner, still argued about weather, still complained about government regulations, still watched everyone else's business. Grant bought nails, hardware cloth, and 2 boxes of screws. As he loaded them into the truck, a voice called out, "Walker." Grant turned. Cliff Dawson, the biggest contractor in the valley. Broad shoulders, permanent smirk. The type of man who enjoyed hearing himself talk. Cliff glanced toward the truck bed. "What in the world are you doing with all that swamp grass?" Grant closed the tailgate. "Building something." Cliff laughed. "Looks more like feeding livestock." Several men standing nearby chuckled. Grant didn't. He simply climbed into the truck. The laughter followed him all the way out of town. That evening, he started building. The second frame rose slowly around the cabin, post by post, beam by beam. Nothing fancy, just practical construction. Grant measured everything twice, sometimes 3 times. Years of military logistics had left him allergic to preventable mistakes. Duke supervised from nearby, occasionally wandering the perimeter, occasionally stopping to stare into the woods, for reasons only he understood. The cabin gradually disappeared behind the growing framework. Each new section gave Grant a little more confidence. Each finished wall looked closer to the vision inside his head, closer to Louisiana, closer to survival. One afternoon, clouds rolled across the mountains earlier than expected. The temperature dropped sharply. Grant decided to haul one final load of reeds before dark. The bundle was heavy, too heavy. He knew it, but old habits were hard to break. He lifted anyway. The path wound through a stand of lodgepole pines near the marsh. The forest stood quiet, too quiet. Duke suddenly stopped. His ears shot forward. Grant noticed immediately. The dog wasn't looking at an animal. He wasn't tracking a scent. He was staring upward. Grant followed his gaze. Nothing. At least, nothing obvious. Then Duke barked. A sharp bark. Not playful. Warning. Grant froze. Years of training snapped awake inside him. Observe. Assess. Move. The German shepherd lunged. His shoulder slammed into Grant's legs. Hard. Hard enough to knock the older man completely off balance. Grant crashed into the snow. At the exact same moment, a terrible cracking sound exploded above them. The tree came down. A massive dead pine, rotten from the inside. The trunk shattered against the ground where Grant had been standing less than a second earlier. Snow burst into the air. Branches snapped. The impact echoed through the forest. Silence followed. Grant lay frozen in the snow, breathing hard. The pine blocked the trail completely. If Duke hadn't moved. He didn't finish the thought. Slowly, he pushed himself upright. Duke stood beside him, tail low, watching, waiting. Grant looked at the fallen tree, then at the dog, then back at the tree. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear. From realization, the margin had been inches, maybe less. Grant reached out and placed both hands on Duke's neck. The German shepherd immediately leaned into him. "You stubborn old fool." Duke licked his chin. Grant laughed despite himself. The sound disappeared into the trees. For a moment, neither moved. The mountains stretched endlessly around them. Snow drifted from the branches overhead. The world seemed impossibly quiet. Then, Grant stood. He looked toward the cabin hidden somewhere beyond the trees, toward the project waiting for him, toward the winter waiting beyond that. And suddenly, the work felt more important than ever. Not because of pride, not because he wanted to prove anyone wrong, because Duke was depending on him, the same way he had depended on Duke moments earlier. That evening, long after sunset, Grant sat beside the stove with a notebook open across his lap. Duke slept nearby, one paw twitching occasionally in dreams. Grant glanced toward him, then wrote a single sentence across the page. "Still air saves heat." The words looked simple, but they carried the weight of everything he was trying to build. Outside, snow drifted through the darkness. Inside, a different future was slowly taking shape. And beyond the valley, people were already beginning to notice the strange structure growing around Grant Walker's cabin. The jokes had started. The laughter was spreading. But winter hadn't arrived yet. And winter was the only judge Grant cared about. The problem was that everyone else seemed eager to deliver their verdict first. By early autumn, the strange structure surrounding Grant Walker's cabin had become the most talked about thing in Elk Creek. The reeds dried beneath the Montana sun, turning from green to golden brown. Layer by layer, Grant packed them between the old cabin walls and the new outer frame. Every section required patience. Every section required adjustment. From a distance, the cabin no longer looked like a cabin. It looked like something abandoned birds might have built, or perhaps something a man had built after finally losing his mind. The rumors spread faster than the cold. One Saturday morning, Grant drove into town for another load of screws and fencing staples. The moment he stepped into Miller's diner, conversations slowed. Not stopped, slowed. That was worse. He could feel eyes following him. People pretending not to stare. People pretending not to whisper. The waitress, Donna Miller, greeted him warmly as always, but even she couldn't completely hide her curiosity. "You still building that thing?" Grant slid onto a stool. "Still building it." Donna poured coffee. "You know half the valley's talking about it." Grant took a sip. "I figured." At a table near the window, laughter erupted. Not loud enough to be rude, just loud enough to be heard. Grant didn't need to look. He already knew who it was. Cliff Dawson, the largest builder in 3 counties. The man had built barns, houses, sheds, and workshops throughout western Montana for nearly 20 years. And lately, he seemed fascinated by Grant's project. Not because he admired it, because he enjoyed mocking it. Cliff leaned back in his chair. "Morning, Walker." Grant nodded once. "Morning," Cliff grinned. "Heard somebody gave your place a new name." Several men around him laughed. Grant kept drinking his coffee. Cliff continued. "The Bird Nest Bunker." "See." More laughter. A few people tried not to smile. Others didn't bother trying. Cliff pointed toward the window. "You, planning to survive winter, or hatch eggs in that thing?" The room erupted again. Grant remained silent. Years ago, the comment might have angered him. Years ago, he might have answered. But war teaches strange lessons. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Some people aren't worth convincing. So he finished his coffee, paid his bill, and left. The laughter followed him out the door. Outside, the mountain air felt cleaner. Duke waited in the truck. The moment Grant climbed inside, the German shepherd studied his face. Dogs notice things, sometimes more than people. Grant scratched behind Duke's ears. "I'm fine." Duke continued staring, not convinced. The drive home was quiet. The mountains rolled beneath a sky the color of steel. Aspens had begun turning gold. Winter wasn't far away. Every day mattered now. Every hour. Back at the cabin, Grant returned to work. The outer wall grew taller, stronger, more complete. Yet something had changed. The voices from town followed him, not because they hurt, because they echoed. Late that night, Grant sat alone by the stove. Wind rattled the windows. The cabin creaked. Duke slept nearby. Grant closed his eyes for a moment. Immediately, another sound emerged. Laughter. Different laughter. Younger laughter. Soldiers sitting around folding chairs beneath a desert sky. Men who never made it home. Faces he hadn't seen in years. Faces he still remembered. The memory arrived without warning. A flash. A voice. Then another. Grant opened his eyes. The cabin returned. The stove. The shadows. The dog. His heartbeat slowly settled. He stood and walked outside. Cold air filled his lungs. The stars above Montana looked sharp enough to cut. Duke followed him onto the porch. Together, they stared into darkness. The mountains remained silent. The town remained far away. For a few minutes, the voices faded. The next morning brought fresh challenges. Grant had nearly completed the northern wall, the most important section, the side that would face winter directly. As he worked, he noticed something unusual. Moisture, just a little. Tiny droplets forming deep inside one section of the structure. He frowned. At first he assumed it was normal. Then he checked another section. Dry. Another. Dry. Back to the first. Wet. Grant's stomach tightened. That wasn't supposed to happen. He carefully removed several reeds, looked deeper. More moisture. Not much, but enough. Enough to cause problems later. The kind of problems winter could turn deadly. For several minutes, he stood motionless. The mountains seemed quieter. The project suddenly looked different, less certain, less brilliant. A possibility entered his mind, the possibility he had tried not to consider. What if Cliff was right? Not about everything, but about this. What if the walls trapped moisture? What if mold formed? What if the reeds rotted? What if the entire system failed during the coldest part of winter? Grant stared at the damp section. The confidence he had carried for weeks weakened, only slightly, but enough. That evening he drove through Elk Creek again, and somehow the laughter sounded louder. By then, the bird nest bunker had become a local joke. People mentioned it at church, at the gas station, at the feed store. Some even drove out of their way to look at it. Grant heard a teenager telling friends he charged $5 to see the world's largest birdhouse. The joke spread through the valley. So did Cliff Dawson's predictions. According to Cliff, the structure wouldn't survive until Christmas. According to Cliff, the reeds would rot, collapse, freeze, or catch fire. Depends on which day you asked him. And people listened. Because Cliff built houses. Grant didn't. That night, after darkness settled over the bitter roots, Grant climbed a ladder with a flashlight. The beam moved carefully across the northern wall, examining every gap, every seam, every reed bundle. Duke followed from below, watching, always watching. Hours passed. The temperature dropped, the stars brightened. Grant finally climbed down. His joints ached, his hands hurt, and the damp section remained unsolved. For the first time since discovering the marsh, doubt sat beside him. Not overwhelming, not defeating, just present, the way cold finds its way through the smallest crack. Grant entered the cabin. Duke followed. The old dog immediately walked toward the northern wall, then stopped. His ears lifted, his head tilted slightly. For several seconds, he stared at one specific section, then he began scratching. Not playfully, not randomly, deliberately. Again, and again. Grant frowned. Duke? The dog ignored him, still scratching. Still focused on the same spot, as if he had found something hidden inside the wall. Something Grant hadn't seen, something important, and for the first time that day, Grant felt a different kind of hope. Because every time Duke acted like that, there was usually a reason. Grant grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen table and followed the dog's stare. The northern wall stood silent in the darkness. Wind brushed softly against the reeds outside. Nothing seemed unusual. At first, Duke scratched the same spot again, then lowered his nose and sniffed along the seam. Grant knelt beside him. The beam from the flashlight slid across the wood frame, across the packed reeds, across the ventilation gap he had built only weeks earlier. Then he saw it, a thin shimmer, tiny droplets hidden deep inside the cavity. Condensation, more than before, far more. Grant's stomach sank. He carefully pulled away several sections of reed packing. Cold air slipped through the opening. The flashlight revealed a narrow channel coated with moisture, not enough to freeze yet. but enough to create trouble. Real trouble. He sat back on his heels. For several seconds, he simply stared. The mountains outside had already begun receiving early snow. The first major storms weren't far away, and now the system he had spent months building showed signs of failure. Duke nudged his shoulder. Grant scratched behind the dog's ears absent-mindedly. His mind was elsewhere, calculating, observing, assessing, the same way he once had during patrols. Identify the weakness, find the cause, fix the problem before it kills someone. Only now the enemy wasn't hidden in a village or behind a ridgeline. It was trapped inside a wall. The next morning, Grant tore open a larger section, then another, and another. By noon, the northern side looked wounded, half-finished, exposed. The more he investigated, the more uneasy he became. The trapped air wasn't circulating correctly. Moisture collected in several pockets. If temperatures dropped quickly, ice could form. If ice formed repeatedly, the reeds could eventually break down. Not immediately, but eventually. Grant sat on an overturned bucket. The cold wind pushed through the exposed frame. For the first time since starting the project, he wondered if he had misunderstood everything. Louisiana wasn't Montana. Swamps weren't mountains. Heat wasn't winter. Maybe he had built a beautiful mistake. A pickup truck slowed on the road. Grant looked up. The driver stared openly at the cabin, then laughed. Even through the closed window, Grant could see it. The truck continued down the road. The laughter lingered, anyway. Over the next few days, word spread. People noticed sections being removed. People noticed construction stopping. People noticed uncertainty, and uncertainty travels quickly through small towns. By Friday morning, Elk Creek had already decided the experiment was collapsing. Grant discovered that the moment he walked into Miller's diner, the room fell quiet. Not completely, just enough. Enough to make the point. Cliff Dawson sat near the front window with 3 contractors, coffee cups, work boots, confident smiles. Cliff spotted Grant immediately. "Morning, Walker." Grant nodded. "Morning." Cliff leaned back. "Heard you're tearing that thing apart already." Several men chuckled. Grant ordered coffee. Ignored them. Cliff continued anyway. "How much longer?" "Before the birds move back in." Laughter spread across the room. Donna Miller rolled her eyes. "Leave him alone, Cliff." Cliff raised both hands dramatically. "I'm serious." He looked around the diner. "I'll give it until Christmas." More laughter. Then he added the line Grant would hear repeated across the valley for weeks. "That cabin won't survive the first real winter storm." Someone slapped the table. Another man laughed so hard coffee spilled onto his shirt. Grant remained silent, but something inside him shifted. Not anger, something heavier, doubt. That afternoon he worked until dark. The wall remained open. The moisture remained unsolved. The questions remained unanswered, and the weather continued getting colder. Near sunset, he climbed a ladder carrying a section of lumber. Halfway up, a sharp metallic crash exploded nearby. A tool slipped from the roof. The sound echoed off the cabin. Grant hit the ground before he consciously understood what happened. Hard, fast. Instantly, his body reacted before thought, before reason, before reality. He rolled behind a stack of lumber, heart hammering, breathing fast, searching, locating, contact, find cover, return. The thought stopped. Silence. No gunfire, no radio, no shouting. Just Montana, just a dropped hammer. Grant remained frozen. His pulse thundered in his ears. The cabin blurred. For a moment, another place tried to replace it. Dust, heat, burning fuel. A convoy road stretching toward the horizon. Then something warm pressed against his shoulder. Duke. The German shepherd stood between Grant and the open yard. Body forward. Protective. Watching. Guarding. Exactly as he always did. Grant closed his eyes. Slow inhale. Slow exhale. The memory faded. The mountains returned. The cabin returned. The dog remained. After a minute, he pushed himself upright. His knees ached. His back hurt. But the embarrassment hurt worse. Nobody had seen it. Yet he still felt exposed. PTSD didn't care whether anyone watched. It arrived when it wanted. It left when it wanted. Grant rubbed Duke's neck. The dog stayed close. The way he always did after moments like that. No questions. No judgment. Just presence. That night the wind returned stronger than before. Grant sat beside the stove, studying sketches spread across the table. Every solution seemed incomplete. Every calculation seemed wrong. The moisture problem refused to disappear. Midnight passed. Then 1 o'clock. Then 2. Sleep never came. Outside, snowflakes drifted through moonlight. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than usual. The walls seemed to lean inward. The pressure built quietly. One thought repeated itself. What if Cliff is right? Not because Cliff understood more, because Winter understood more. And winter was coming. Grant finally blew out the lantern and headed toward bed. Duke remained near the northern wall, watching, listening. The old dog rarely ignored a command. Tonight, he barely noticed Grant moving. His attention stayed fixed on the same section. Then suddenly, he began scratching again. Harder this time, more urgently. His claws scraped against the boards. Again, again, again. Grant stopped. The dog wasn't acting curious. He was trying to tell him something. Something hidden deeper inside the wall. Something Grant still hadn't found. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that realization kept him awake long after the cabin went dark. Because, if Duke was right, the answer might already be inside the wall, waiting to be discovered before winter arrived. Grant barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the damp cavity hidden inside the northern wall. Each time he drifted off, Duke's scratching echoed through his thoughts. Around 4 in the morning, he finally gave up. The stove still glowed faintly. The cabin sat in darkness. Outside, snow drifted across the valley beneath a pale moon. Duke was already awake. Ryder, the German shepherd, stood beside the same section of wall, waiting. Grant pulled on his boots, grabbed a lantern, and walked over. All right, partner. Duke's ears lifted. Grant removed several boards, then more. Cold air slipped through the opening. The lantern cast long shadows into the cavity. At first, he saw nothing, just reeds, wood, air gaps. Then he noticed something strange. The moisture wasn't spread evenly. It concentrated around one narrow channel, a dead zone, an area where air wasn't moving. Grant studied it carefully. His military training resurfaced. Observe, identify patterns, find the weakness. The problem wasn't the reeds. The problem wasn't the wall. The problem was airflow. One section had become isolated from the ventilation system. Moisture entered, but never escaped. Grant sat back and smiled for the first time in days. Duke immediately wagged his tail, as if he already knew. You stubborn genius. The dog pressed against him. Grant laughed softly. The tension that had gripped him for a week finally loosened. Not gone, but weaker. For the next several days, he worked from dawn until dark. New ventilation slots appeared beneath the eaves. Several reed chambers were rebuilt entirely. Others were adjusted. Grant changed packing density, loosened some sections, compressed others. The system slowly evolved. Every adjustment went into the notebook. Every observation, every temperature reading, every humidity check. The project stopped being an idea. It became a living experiment. And little by little, the moisture disappeared. By the middle of October, the northern wall remained dry. The readings stabilized. For the first time, Grant believed the cabin might actually survive winter. Not because he hoped, because the numbers supported it. The evidence supported it. Even so, the laughter continued. One afternoon, he stopped by the feed store. The moment he entered, 2 men near the counter fell silent. Another smirked. Someone muttered, "Bird nest bunker." The nickname had become permanent. Grant barely noticed anymore. He had heard worse things in worse places. Besides, every hour spent arguing was an hour not spent preparing. Winter didn't care about opinions. Winter cared about results. The mountains taught that lesson every year. A week later, Grant woke before sunrise to Duke growling. Not barking, growling. Low, focused, danger. Grant was out of bed instantly. Years of ranger training, never truly, disappeared. He moved toward the window. No lights. No vehicles. No people. Then he saw movement. Near the tree line. Large, silent, watching. A mountain lion. The animal stood partially hidden among the pines. Its eyes reflected pale gold in the darkness. Grant's hand tightened around the flashlight. The lion wasn't attacking. Yet. But it wasn't leaving either. Duke moved closer to the door. Every muscle in his body tense. Grant opened the cabinet and retrieved an air horn. He hated using it, but he preferred avoiding conflict whenever possible. He stepped onto the porch, the cold bit immediately. The mountain lion remained motionless, watching, calculating. Grant blasted the horn. The sound shattered the silence. The lion flinched, then disappeared into the trees. Problem solved. Or so he thought. The next evening, it returned, and the evening after that, each time closer, each time bolder. Food grew scarce during autumn. Predators took risks. Grant knew that. The fourth visit happened just after sunset. Grant was stacking firewood behind the cabin. Duke wandered nearby. End quote. The first 40, 33, everything seemed normal. Until Duke froze. Grant recognized the posture immediately. The same posture he used before danger appeared. The dog stared toward a cluster of pines. A blur exploded from the shadows. The mountain lion, fast, silent, far faster than Grant expected. The animal wasn't charging him. It was charging toward the cabin, toward the stored food, toward the livestock pen, belonging to a neighbor half a mile away. Duke didn't hesitate. The German shepherd launched forward. Grant shouted, "Duke!" Too late. The dog collided with the lion in a burst of fur and snow. Both animals disappeared behind a stack of logs. Growls erupted. Snarls. The sound of bodies crashing through brush. Grant sprinted toward them. Adrenaline flooded his system. The world narrowed. Distance. Movement. Threat. For one terrifying moment he saw only flashes. The lion broke free first. Startled. Confused. Angry. Then it vanished into the forest. Gone. The silence afterward felt enormous. Grant reached the logs. Duke. The German shepherd emerged slowly, breathing hard. One shoulder stained dark. Grant's stomach dropped. Blood. Not much, but enough. Duke limped toward him, still trying to wag his tail, as if everything was fine. As if he hadn't just thrown himself at a mountain lion. Grant dropped to one knee. His hands moved automatically. Assess. Control bleeding. Check depth. Years of emergency training returned without effort. The wound looked worse than it was. Several long cuts. No major damage, but close. Far too close. Back inside the cabin, Grant cleaned the wounds beneath lantern light. Duke never complained. Never pulled away. The old dog simply rested his head on Grant's knee, trusting him completely. Grant carefully stitched the deepest cut, using supplies from an old military trauma kit, the same kind he once carried overseas. The same hands that had treated wounded soldiers now worked on a wounded dog. Hours passed. The storm outside strengthened. The lantern flickered. When he finally finished, Duke lay sleeping beside the stove. Safe. For now. Grant sat nearby watching him. The cabin felt quiet, smaller somehow. The realization arrived unexpectedly, not through words, not through thought, through fear. The image of Duke not coming back from that fight. The image refused to leave. Grant stared into the fire. He had lost people before. Good people. Too many. The possibility of losing Duke struck somewhere deeper. Because after all these years, after all the winters, after all the nights when nightmares came and Duke pulled him back to reality, the German shepherd wasn't simply a dog. He was the last partner Grant trusted completely. Outside, the first snowstorm of the season rolled over the Bitterroots. Wind pushed against the new walls. The reeds remained still. The cabin remained warm. Yet Grant barely noticed. His attention stayed on the sleeping dog. Because for the first time since this project began, he understood the truth. He hadn't built the cabin for himself. Not really. He built it for Duke. And somewhere beyond the mountains, weather forecasters were beginning to talk about a winter unlike anything Montana had seen in decades. The warnings had just begun, and they were about to change everything. The first forecast came from a weather report Grant heard on an old battery-powered radio while repairing a section of fencing. The announcer's voice crackled through static. Arctic pressure system moving south. Historic temperature drop possible. Dangerous wind conditions across western Montana. Grant stopped hammering. The radio continued. Potent. Potentially the coldest event in decades. The words lingered in the air long after the report ended. Duke looked up from where he rested beside a woodpile. His shoulder had mostly healed. The stitches were out. But Grant still noticed a slight stiffness whenever the dog stood too quickly. The sight bothered him more than he admitted. That evening, he drove into Elk Creek. The town felt different. People weren't laughing as much anymore. The feed store was crowded. Pickup trucks lined the road. Propane tanks disappeared from inventory. Generators sold out. Everywhere Grant looked, people were preparing. Winter wasn't a joke anymore. At Miller's diner, conversations revolved around weather maps and predictions. A rancher near the window shook his head. "They're calling it the Northern Ghost Freeze." Someone else laughed nervously. "Sounds like something from a horror movie." The laughter died quickly. Nobody seemed convinced. Not even Cliff Dawson. Grant noticed that immediately. The contractor still sat at his usual table, still drank his usual coffee, still carried the same confident expression. But there was tension around his eyes now. Even so, he couldn't resist. The moment Grant entered, Cliff grinned. "Looks like your birdhouse is about to get tested." Several people chuckled. Grant ordered coffee, ignored him. Cliff continued. "Guess we'll finally see whether swampgrass beats Montana." Grant stirred his coffee slowly, then looked toward the large window, overlooking Main Street. Snow had already begun falling, early, heavy. The season felt different. The mountains seemed to know something. Grant finished his coffee and left without saying a word. Outside, cold air bit at his face. Duke waited patiently in the truck. The dog watched him climb inside, then rested his head on Grant's arm. The gesture lasted only a second, but it said enough. The drive home passed beneath darkening skies. The bitterroots disappeared behind gathering clouds. By the time Grant reached the cabin, snow covered the road. That night he sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. A different notebook, not the construction log, a preparation list. The habits never left. Military training had a way of becoming permanent, especially when survival depended on it. Water, food, fuel, medical supplies, backup heat, emergency shelter, communication. Grant moved through the checklist methodically, line by line. No panic, no wasted motion. The same approach he once used before operations overseas. Assess resources, identify vulnerabilities, prepare for worst-case scenarios. By midnight, the list covered several pages. The next morning, preparations intensified. Extra firewood went beneath tarps. Water barrels were filled. Fuel was stored. Snowshoes were inspected. Emergency gear checked. Rechecked, then checked again. Duke followed him through every task. Watching, learning, participating. At one point, Grant retrieved an old set of hand signals. Simple commands he had used years ago. Stop. Stay. Move. Return. Search. The German shepherd remembered most of them immediately. The rest returned after a few repetitions. Grant couldn't help smiling. "You're showing off." Duke's tail swept through the snow. A few days later, temperatures began falling rapidly. The first real blast of Arctic air swept across Montana. Creeks froze overnight. Livestock gathered tightly against fences. Even the birds seemed quieter. The valley held its breath. Then came the official warning. The Weather Service interrupted regular programming. The radio crackled. The announcer sounded unusually serious. Extreme wind chills expected. Temperatures potentially below -40. Travel strongly discouraged. Danger to life possible. Grant looked toward the window. Outside, snow moved sideways, not falling, flying. The first edge of the storm had arrived. He walked through the cabin one final time, checking every section, every wall, every vent, every measurement. The reed system remained dry, stable, working exactly as intended. The numbers reassured him, but experience taught caution. Nature always found ways to surprise people, especially confident people. By sunset, the valley had disappeared. Snow swallowed the mountains. The road vanished. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Wind slammed against the cabin. The new walls absorbed the impact differently, not fighting it, softening it. The structure barely creaked. Grant noticed immediately. So did Duke. The dog raised his head from beside the stove, listening, waiting. The cabin held. Hour after hour. The storm strengthened. Grant sat beside the radio. The broadcast faded in and out through static. Reports arrived from nearby counties. Road closures, power outages, livestock losses. The northern ghost freeze was no longer a prediction. It was here. Near midnight, Grant stepped onto the porch. The wind hit like a physical force. It stole his breath instantly. Snow raced across the darkness. The thermometer nailed beside the door rattled violently. He shined a flashlight toward it. The beam shook. The temperature had already dropped below zero, and the storm was just beginning. Grant closed the door quickly. Inside, warmth greeted him. Not perfect warmth, but real warmth, the kind the cabin had never known before. He glanced toward Duke. The German shepherd slept soundly beside the stove, not shivering, not curled into a tight ball, sleeping normally. For the first time in years, Grant stood there watching him. A strange feeling settled over him, not confidence. Not yet, something quieter, hope, the kind that arrives cautiously, the kind that doesn't want to be disappointed. Outside, the northern ghost freeze continued moving south, across ranches, across forests, across towns, toward every cabin in the valley, toward every family, waiting to see if their preparations were enough. And somewhere beyond the storm, winter itself was finally coming to judge Grant Walker's strange, reed-wrapped cabin. The test had begun. By the third day, the northern ghost freeze no longer felt like weather. It felt like pressure, constant, relentless, personal. The wind never stopped. It howled through the Bitterroot Mountains day and night, driving snow across the valley and long white rivers that erased roads, fences, and landmarks. From his porch, Grant could barely see 50 yards. Everything beyond that had vanished. The world had been reduced to white. Inside the cabin, he checked the thermometer 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, night. The numbers surprised him every time. The temperature remained steady. Not perfect, but steady. The walls were working. The reeds were working. The trapped air was doing exactly what he had hoped. For the first time in years, Duke slept through entire nights without shivering. That alone felt miraculous. But outside the cabin, things were falling apart. The radio reports grew worse every day. Road closures, frozen water lines, livestock losses. Emergency crews stretched thin. One rancher lost power for 36 straight hours. Another family abandoned their house and moved into a barn beside their cattle because animal heat was the only warmth they had left. The storm wasn't simply cold. It was exhausting people, grinding them down, one problem at a time. Then came the call for help. It arrived shortly after dawn on the 5th day. Grant had just finished checking firewood levels when the radio crackled unexpectedly. A voice fought through static, weak, broken, desperate, truck stuck. 1. The family. Can't move. Then silence. Grant turned the volume higher. Nothing. The transmission was gone, but he had heard enough. A family was stranded somewhere, and conditions were getting worse by the hour. Duke was already standing. The German shepherd had heard the change in Grant's voice. Grant moved automatically. The old ranger instincts returned. Layer clothing, check fuel, medical kit, rope, snowshoes, emergency blankets. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The plan formed quickly. A county service road ran east through the valley. If the stranded vehicle had attempted to cross before the storm intensified, it could be anywhere along a 10-mile stretch. A difficult search, but not impossible. Grant clipped a lead onto Duke's harness. The dog immediately moved toward the door. Ready, always ready. Outside, the storm hit them like a wall. Snow stung exposed skin. Wind stole breath. Visibility shifted from minute to minute, sometimes 50 yards, sometimes 5. Grant and Duke moved slowly, carefully, following the buried road. The world looked unfamiliar. Even places Grant knew well had become distorted. Snowdrifts swallowed fences. Trees emerged like ghosts. The valley felt abandoned. Nearly 2 hours passed. Then Duke stopped. His ears lifted. He turned sharply toward a line of snow-covered cottonwoods. Grant followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then a dark shape beneath drifting snow. A vehicle, half buried. The truck had slid off the road. Grant hurried forward. Inside were a young couple and their daughter, cold, frightened, but alive. The father rolled down the window. Relief flooded his face. "I thought nobody was coming." Grant nodded. "Let's get you out." The rescue took nearly an hour. The truck couldn't be recovered. Not in those conditions, but people could. Grant guided them back toward his cabin, using a safety line tied between everyone. Duke moved ahead, constantly checking the route. Several times the dog corrected their direction when blowing snow erased tracks completely. The little girl eventually reached down and touched Duke's back. The German Shepherd glanced at her but never broke stride. Still working, still guiding. By the time they reached the cabin, darkness had already begun creeping across the valley. The family stepped inside and immediately stopped. The warmth surprised them. Grant recognized the expression. He'd worn it himself weeks earlier when the system first started working. The mother looked around, then at the walls, then at Grant. "How is it this warm in here?" Grant shrugged. "Long story." That night, the family slept safely beside the stove. For the first time in days. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, the cabin held. The next morning brought another emergency. Then, another. Word spread quickly. People learned that Grant's cabin remained accessible. People learned it stayed warm. People learned he answered radio calls. Soon he was helping wherever he could, delivering supplies, checking isolated neighbors, transporting medicine. Never alone. Duke accompanied him every time. Then, during a rescue near the frozen creek, disaster struck. Visibility had dropped again. The storm was near its peak. Grant and Duke were leading an elderly couple back toward safety when Duke suddenly yelped. The sound cut through the wind, sharp, painful. Grant spun immediately. The dog had broken through a crust of wind-packed ice, hidden beneath fresh snow. One front leg disappeared into the frozen surface. The jagged edge sliced deep before Duke pulled free. Blood stained the snow, bright red against white. Grant dropped to one knee. The old couple stood silently nearby. Duke tried to keep walking. That made it worse. Grant examined the wound quickly. Not life-threatening, but deeper than he wanted. Far deeper. The dog should have rested. Any normal dog would have. Duke simply looked at him, waiting. Ready to continue. Grant wrapped the leg with emergency bandages, the same calm movements he had used hundreds of times before. Yet his hands felt heavier now. The storm seemed louder. The valley seemed colder. Because this wasn't some distant injury. This was Duke, his partner. The one creature who had stayed beside him through everything. "You're done for today." Duke disagreed immediately. The dog stood, tested the leg, then moved forward. Still limping, still determined. Grant almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he shook his head. Stubborn. The German Shepherd looked back as if to say the same thing. Together they led the couple home. Together they finished the mission. But that night, as Duke slept beside the stove, Grant noticed something he hadn't seen before. The dog favored the injured leg even in his sleep. Every movement seemed slower, every step more careful. Outside, the storm showed no signs of ending. Inside, the cabin remained warm. The walls held, the valley broke. And for the first time since winter began, Grant found himself worried about something far more important than the weather. Because Duke was limping, and deep down, Grant knew the injury was worse than the dog was willing to admit. For 2 days, he tried keeping Duke inside. For 2 days, Duke ignored every attempt. The German Shepherd still followed him from room to room. Still checked the windows. Still watched the door. Still insisted on accompanying him whenever he stepped outside. The limp was obvious now, especially after long walks. But the stubbornness remained stronger. Grant had seen the same trait in soldiers. Men who kept moving because others depended on them. Men who hid injuries until the mission ended. Sometimes, that kind of loyalty was admirable. Sometimes it was dangerous. The storm entered its second week. By then, the northern ghost freeze had become the only thing people talked about. The radio delivered fresh reports every few hours. More livestock lost. More roads closed. More emergency requests. Entire stretches of western Montana seemed frozen in place. One morning, the temperature outside dropped to 38 below zero. Not wind chill, actual temperature. Grant stared at the thermometer, nailed beside the porch. The red column looked impossible. Then he stepped back inside and looked at the thermometer hanging near the center beam. 66 degrees. Grant checked it twice. Then a third time. The reading didn't change. He stood there silently, listening. The stove burned low, not roaring, not struggling, just working. The cabin felt comfortable, almost ordinary. Outside, the world was becoming hostile. Inside, Duke slept beside the stove without shivering. The contrast felt unreal. Over the next several days, Grant noticed something else. The woodpile wasn't shrinking the way it normally did. During previous winters, he constantly fed the stove. every few hours, sometimes every hour. Now the fire burned slowly, steadily. The cabin simply held the warmth, exactly as he had hoped, exactly as he had designed. The realization should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt strange, like watching a prediction become reality. Then came the visitor. Late one afternoon, a snowmobile appeared through the blowing snow. The machine stopped near the cabin. A man climbed off, wrapped in layers, face nearly hidden. Grant recognized him anyway. Tom Bennett, a Forest Service ranger. Grant opened the door before Tom reached it. The ranger stepped inside, then stopped. Completely stopped. For several seconds, he didn't say a word. His eyes moved around the room, the stove, the walls, the windows. Then he removed one glove, slowly, almost suspiciously. "What in the world?" Grant poured coffee. Tom walked toward a window, touched the frame. No frost. He checked another. Same result. Then he looked at the thermometer. His eyebrows climbed noticeably. 66? Grant nodded. Tom turned toward him. Outside, wind hammered the cabin hard enough to rattle the porch railing. Inside, a coffee cup sat on the table without even trembling. The ranger shook his head. "I've spent all week checking cabins." He glanced around again. "None of them feel like this." Grant simply handed him coffee. Tom accepted it without taking his eyes off the walls. The silence stretched. Eventually, the ranger stepped back outside. Before leaving, he stopped beside his snowmobile and looked at the cabin one more time. The strange structure everyone laughed at, the bird nest bunker, the giant pile of reeds, the joke. Then he drove away. By the next morning, people were talking. Again, only this time the laughter sounded different. Curiosity had replaced mockery. Tom Bennett wasn't the type to exaggerate. When he told people the cabin felt warm at 38 below, they listened. At first, only a few, then more. Soon, stories spread across the valley. People claimed the windows never frosted. People claimed the stove barely needed wood. People claimed Grant was somehow heating the cabin with hidden equipment. That rumor lasted less than a day. Most people knew Grant couldn't afford such things. The mystery remained. 3 days later, another vehicle appeared, then another. Some only slowed down on the road. Others stopped. Several simply stared. Grant mostly ignored them. The walls didn't care what people thought. The temperature didn't care either. Every morning he continued recording measurements. Indoor temperature, outdoor temperature, humidity, firewood use. The notebook filled steadily, page after page. Evidence, not opinions, not theories. Facts. The same approach that had guided him from the beginning. One evening, shortly before sunset, Grant stepped outside with Duke. The storm had weakened slightly, not ended, just eased enough to reveal pieces of the valley again. Snow covered everything. The mountains looked carved from ice. The world felt silent, strangely silent. Grant noticed Duke standing near the porch. The dog's injured leg remained stiff, but his eyes looked brighter, more alert. The warmth helped. The rest helped. Still, Grant worried. Duke moved beside him and sat quietly. Together they watched smoke drift from the chimney. Only a thin gray ribbon, nothing like the thick black clouds pouring from other homes across the valley. The cabin needed less fuel, much less. Another sign the system worked. Grant looked toward the distant road. A dark vehicle emerged through the snow, moving slowly, purposefully. Unlike the curious visitors who came before, this driver wasn't sightseeing. The truck stopped near the gate. The engine shut off. For a moment, nobody emerged. Then, the door opened. A tall figure stepped out. Broad shoulders, heavy coat, confident walk. Even from a distance, Grant recognized him immediately. Cliff Dawson, the man who had laughed louder than anyone else. The man who promised the cabin wouldn't survive until Christmas. Now, he stood staring at the bird nest bunker while snow drifted around him. Grant glanced down at Duke. The German shepherd watched silently, then looked back toward Cliff. Neither moved. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Because for the first time since winter began, the man who mocked the cabin most was finally coming to see it for himself. And somehow, Grant knew this visit would change more than one mind. Cliff Dawson stopped beside the gate and stared at the cabin for several long seconds. Snow drifted around him. The wind tugged at his coat. Yet, he didn't move. The bird nest bunker stood exactly where it always had. Layers of reeds, hidden beneath rough timber. A structure the entire valley had laughed at. A structure that should have failed weeks ago. Grant waited quietly. Duke sat beside him. The German shepherd's injured legs stretched slightly forward. His posture remained alert, watching, measuring. Finally, Cliff walked toward the porch. His boots crunched through packed snow. The sound echoed strangely in the frozen silence. Grant opened the door before Cliff reached it. Neither man spoke. Not immediately. Cliff stepped inside, then stopped. Exactly like Tom Bennett had. Exactly like everyone else. The warmth hit him first. Not excessive warmth. Not furnace heat. Comfort. Simple comfort. The kind that shouldn't have existed during a storm like this. Outside, the temperature hovered near 40 below. Inside, the air felt calm, stable, almost normal. Cliff slowly removed one glove, then the other. His eyes moved across the room. The stove, the walls, the windows, the ceiling. Everything looked ordinary. That seemed to bother him most. Grant poured coffee. Cliff accepted it, automatically, still staring. Finally, he walked toward the nearest wall. Pressed his palm against it. His expression changed immediately. The wall wasn't cold, not even cool. It felt neutral, almost alive, like it belonged to another season. Cliff checked another section, then another, then the window frame. No frost, no moisture, no ice. Outside, a gust slammed against the cabin. The structure barely reacted. Inside, the coffee in Cliff's cup never rippled. The contractor stood motionless. Years of experience told him something impossible was happening, and yet it was happening right in front of him. Grant sat at the table, said nothing. He didn't need to. The numbers could speak for themselves. After several minutes, he reached for a worn notebook. The construction journal. Months of notes, months of measurements, months of trial and error. He slid it across the table. Cliff opened it. The room grew quiet, except for the crackle of the stove. Temperature readings, humidity levels, ventilation changes, wood consumption, daily observations. Every adjustment carefully recorded, every mistake documented, every improvement tracked, page after page. Evidence, not opinions, not theories, facts. Cliff turned pages slowly. The deeper he went, the less he spoke. The numbers became impossible to ignore. Firewood usage nearly cut in half. Indoor temperatures consistently higher than neighboring cabins. Stable humidity. No mold. No rot. No collapse. Everything he predicted would happen hadn't. The storm continued pounding the valley outside. Inside, the truth sat quietly on paper. Eventually, Cliff closed the notebook. For several moments, he stared at the cover, then toward the walls, then toward Grant. You kept records on all of it. Grant nodded, needed to know what worked. Cliff looked around again. A man who built houses for a living rarely admitted surprise, but surprise filled the room anyway. We've been building cabins the same way for decades. Grant shrugged. So have I. The contractor laughed softly. Not mockingly, not this time. Just honestly. The sound felt different. For the first time since this entire thing began, there was no ridicule in it, only disbelief, then respect. Outside, darkness settled across the valley. The storm continued. The two men talked quietly for another hour, about ventilation, airflow, wood consumption. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. Any time, just practical conversation. Exactly the kind Grant preferred. At some point, Cliff glanced toward Duke. The German shepherd lay beside the stove, eyes closed, breathing steadily. His injured leg rested awkwardly beneath him. You know, Cliff said quietly, that dog might be smarter than both of us. Grant smiled. Probably. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. The storm outside, the warmth inside, the strange satisfaction of seeing reality finally overcome doubt. Then Duke stood, slowly. Too slowly. Grant noticed immediately. The dog took one step, then another. His injured leg trembled. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Duke? The German shepherd looked toward him. His eyes seemed unfocused. The room suddenly felt smaller. Grant rose from his chair. Duke tried to move again. His front legs buckled. The dog collapsed hard against the floorboards. The coffee cup slipped from Cliff's hand. It shattered. Neither man looked at it. Grant was already beside Duke. Duke. No response. The dog's breathing came fast. Too fast. His body felt hot. Far hotter than it should. Grant's stomach tightened. The injury. The rescues. The storm. The exhaustion. The dog had kept going long after he should have stopped. Exactly the way some soldiers did. Exactly the way Grant himself once had. Until the body finally refused. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls. Inside, nothing mattered anymore. Not the cabin, not the storm, not the notebook, not the victory. Grant dropped to one knee beside his partner. The room blurred for a moment. A memory flashed. Desert sand. A wounded ranger. Blood on gloves. A medic shouting. Then the memory vanished. Only Duke remained. Grant checked the wound, checked his breathing, checked his pulse. The movements came automatically. Years of training, years of habit, years of fear. Cliff stood silently nearby. The same man who had mocked the cabin for months, now watching something far more important unfold. The realization hit Grant with brutal force. The cabin had survived. The walls had survived. The storm had failed. But none of that mattered if Duke didn't. And as the northern ghost freeze tightened its grip on Montana, the greatest challenge of the winter was no longer outside the cabin. It was lying motionless beside the stove. And for the first time in weeks, Grant felt truly afraid. The storm continued outside. The walls shook occasionally beneath powerful gusts. Snow rattled against the windows. But inside the cabin, time seemed to stop. Grant knelt beside Duke. One hand rested on the dog's chest. Counting breaths. Watching. Waiting. The German shepherd's eyes remained closed. His breathing was shallow. Uneven. Exhaustion. Pain. Weeks of pushing beyond his limits. Grant knew the signs. He had seen them before. Different battlefield. Different partner. Same look. Cliff Dawson remained near the table. Silent. Unsure what to do. The man who had mocked the cabin for months suddenly seemed very small, very human. "What can I do?" he finally asked. Grant didn't answer immediately. His attention never left Duke. "Get me the first aid bag." Cliff moved instantly. No arguments, no jokes, no pride. The bag appeared beside Grant seconds later. The old ranger examined the wound again. No infection, no serious bleeding, but Duke was exhausted, completely exhausted. The realization settled heavily into the room. The dog hadn't collapsed because of one injury. He had collapsed because he never stopped. Every rescue, every search, every trip into the storm, every mile through deep snow, every act of loyalty had added another burden, and Duke had carried them all without complaint. Hours passed. The wind screamed outside. Grant never left his side. Eventually, Cliff rose, pulled on his coat, paused near the door. For several moments, he stared at the reed-lined walls, the structure he had ridiculed, the structure now sheltering both men. Then he looked toward Grant. "I'm sorry. The words hung quietly in the air. Grant looked up. Cliff shook his head. For all of it. The cabin. The jokes. The laughter. Everything. Grant studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said. Cliff left. The storm swallowed him almost immediately. Night settled over the valley. Grant remained beside Duke. The radio crackled occasionally. Emergency traffic, weather updates, requests for assistance. Then, just after midnight, another message broke through. The voice sounded panicked. A group of residents, missing. Last seen near an abandoned logging road high on the eastern slope. The storm had trapped them. Visibility near zero. Temperatures dropping. The search teams couldn't reach them until morning. Morning might be too late. Grant stared at the radio. The room fell silent. Then he looked at Duke. The dog slowly opened one eye. Just one. As if he somehow understood. No. Grant shook his head. Not this time. But Duke was already trying to stand. The movement looked painful. His injured leg trembled. Yet the determination remained. Grant closed his eyes briefly. The old conflict returned. Duty. Responsibility. Risk. He knew exactly where the logging road was. Years of hiking and hunting had taught him every ridge and creek in the valley. The route was dangerous, but possible. And if people were truly stranded out there, time mattered. By 1 in the morning, Grant was moving through the storm again. Not because he wanted to, because he couldn't ignore the call. Duke rode beside him on the snowmobile for part of the journey. Wrapped in blankets, protected from the wind. The mountain disappeared into darkness around them. Snow erased the landscape. The world became shapes and shadows. Grant relied on memory, terrain recognition, landmarks, hidden beneath snow. Old Ranger instincts: move, observe, adjust, survive. Near the logging road, visibility collapsed completely. The snowmobile couldn't go farther. They continued on foot. Duke moved beside him, limping, but moving. Grant hated every step the dog took. Yet stopping him proved impossible. An hour later they found the first sign. A scarf frozen beneath drifting snow. Then a glove. Then tracks. Almost erased. Almost invisible. Grant might have missed them. Duke didn't. The German shepherd lowered his nose. Followed the scent. Turned uphill. Grant followed. Minutes later he heard voices. Faint. Distant. Human. The group had taken shelter behind a fallen stand of timber. 5 people. Cold. Terrified. But alive. Relief flooded their faces when they saw him. One woman started crying immediately. Another man simply sat down in the snow, too exhausted to speak. The return journey took hours. Slow. Painful. Dangerous. Grant moved the group in stages. Shelter. Movement. Shelter again. The same principles he once used in survival training. All the while, Duke stayed near the front, guiding, checking, leading. At dawn, they finally reached lower ground. Rescue crews met them there. Everyone survived. Every single person. One of the deputies approached Grant afterward. "You saved them." Grant looked down. Duke stood beside him. Barely. The dog swayed slightly, then steadied himself. Grant shook his head. No. The deputy followed his gaze. Understanding arrived immediately. Duke had found the tracks. Duke had found the people. Duke had found the path home. The storm finally began weakening later that day. For the first time in weeks, patches of blue appeared above the mountains. Grant returned to the cabin exhausted, completely drained. He helped Duke inside. The German shepherd walked directly to his spot beside the stove, curled up, lowered his head, closed his eyes. Grant sat beside him, the same way he once sat beside wounded rangers in distant deserts, the same way he sat beside friends waiting for helicopters, waiting, watching, refusing to sleep. Hours passed. The sun disappeared. Darkness returned. Duke never moved. Not once. Grant remained beside him all night. The cabin stayed warm. The storm finally faded. The valley slowly emerged from beneath the snow. And sometime after dawn, silence settled over the mountains. A deep silence. The kind that comes only after great storms. Grant looked toward the window. The sky was clear. The northern ghost freeze was finally ending. Then he looked down. Duke still hadn't opened his eyes. And for the first time all winter, the cabin felt cold again. Grant sat beside him as daylight slowly filled the room. The storm was over. The wind had finally surrendered. Outside, sunlight touched the snow-covered bitterroots for the first time in weeks. Inside, none of it mattered. The stove burned quietly. The walls held warmth exactly as they were designed to do. The thermometer still read 66 degrees. Grant never looked at it. His attention remained fixed on Duke. The German shepherd lay motionless beside the stove, breathing, but barely. Every few minutes Grant checked again. A hand on the chest, a hand behind the ears, listening, waiting. The same routine repeated hour after hour. Memories drifted through his mind. The first day Duke came home, the first hunt, the first winter, the first time the dog woke him from a nightmare before he fell out of bed, the first time Duke stood between him and a stranger on a dark trail, the thousands of small moments nobody else ever saw, the moments that built a partnership. Outside, vehicles began appearing along the road. The valley was waking up. People emerged from homes. Neighbors checked on neighbors. Crews cleared snow. Life slowly returned. Several visitors stopped by the cabin. Grant barely noticed. Tom Bennett arrived. Then the sheriff. Then the family rescued during the storm. Everyone wanted to thank him. Everyone wanted to see the famous cabin. Grant accepted their words politely, then returned to Duke. Nothing else seemed important. By noon, Sunlight poured through the windows. The warmth inside the cabin felt gentle, peaceful, almost spring-like. Grant sat on the floor with one hand resting on Duke's shoulder. His eyes felt heavy. He hadn't slept properly in 2 days. Eventually, fatigue won. His head lowered. Just for a moment. Just long enough. A soft sound woke him. Not wind. Not the stove. Not a memory. A sigh. Grant looked down instantly. The German shepherd's ears twitched. Once. Then again. Grant froze. His heart hammered harder than it had during any storm. Duke? The dog didn't move. For one terrifying second, Grant thought he imagined it. Then one eye opened, slowly, sleepily, confused. Exactly the way Duke always woke from deep sleep. Grant laughed. The sound escaped before he could stop it. Then another laugh followed. And another. The relief hit him so hard he had to look away. The German shepherd blinked several times, lifted his head, then looked directly at Grant, as if wondering why the old man suddenly seemed so emotional. Grant scratched behind his ears. The tail thumped weakly against the floor. One time, then again. That was enough. More than enough. The greatest battle of the winter had finally ended. Weeks later, the valley looked different. Not because the snow disappeared, because attitudes had. People who once laughed now visited with notebooks. Contractors arrived with questions. Ranchers wanted measurements. Families wanted advice. The bird nest bunker nickname quietly disappeared. Nobody used it anymore. The joke wasn't funny now. The results were too obvious. One afternoon, Cliff Dawson returned, this time carrying a rolled set of construction plans. He spread them across Grant's table. New cabin designs, modified wall systems, ventilation channels inspired by the reed structure. Cliff pointed toward one section. "We're starting to build these next season." Grant studied the drawings, then looked up. Cliff smiled. A genuine smile this time. No point ignoring something that works. Throughout the following year, several families built simplified versions of the system. The winter after that, even more followed. Fuel consumption dropped. Cabins stayed warmer. People survived storms more comfortably than before. The idea spread beyond Elk Creek, then beyond the valley. Eventually, engineers from Missoula visited, then researchers, then journalists. Most arrived expecting a story about unusual construction. Most left talking about something else entirely. Years passed. The reeds aged gracefully. The walls remained dry. The cabin endured every season Montana threw at it. And Duke remained exactly where he preferred to be, beside Grant. One crisp autumn afternoon, several years later, a reporter arrived to write a feature about the famous design. By then, people had begun calling it something official. The Duke envelope system. Grant hated the name. The valley loved it. The reporter spent hours photographing the cabin, examining the walls, interviewing neighbors. Finally, as the sun settled behind the mountains, he asked the question everyone always asked. What does it feel like proving everyone wrong? Grant stood on the porch. The bitter roots glowed gold beneath the evening light. Nearby, an older Duke rested in a patch of sunshine. Gray fur had appeared around his muzzle. His movements were slower now, but his eyes remained the same. The reporter waited, pen ready, expecting a triumphant answer, a victory speech, something dramatic. Grant looked at Duke. The dog lifted his head slightly. Their eyes met. Then Grant smiled, a small smile, the kind reserved for old friends. I wasn't trying to prove anybody wrong. The reporter paused. Grant reached down and scratched the silver fur behind Duke's ears. The German shepherd closed his eyes contentedly. For a moment, the mountains, the cabin, the fame, the engineering, all of it faded into the background. Only the two of them remained. Grant looked back toward the reporter. I was just trying to get my partner through one more winter. The reporter lowered his pen. Because there wasn't anything left to improve. The answer already contained the truth. Far below, the valley stretched beneath the fading sunlight. Cabins stood scattered across the snow-dusted landscape, many now built using ideas born from reeds, patience, and persistence. The cabin itself stood quietly among the pines, strong, warm, enduring. Yet anyone who truly understood the story knew something important. The walls were never the hero, not really. The engineering mattered, the survival mattered, the winter mattered, but the heart of the story had always been something else. A lonely veteran, a loyal German shepherd, and a friendship strong enough to carry them through the coldest season of their lives. As evening settled across the Bitterroot Mountains, Duke rested at Grant's feet. The old soldier sat beside him. Neither needed words. The winter had already said everything that mattered. And at last, both of them were home. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. If you believe loyalty like Duke's is something truly special, leave a simple 1 in the comments. And if you've ever had a dog, a friend, or a partner who stood by you through life's hardest seasons, leave a 2. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if stories like this remind you that courage, loyalty, and kindness still exist in the world, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. There are many more unforgettable stories waiting just ahead, and I'd love for you to be here when the next journey begins. Until next time, take care of yourself. And the ones who never stop standing beside you.